The river that flowed out of Eden, not the garden. Okay? Now see if you can follow this. Now, this is a challenge for you. Look for it. You can't find it. The Scripture never relates Eden as being a land on the earth. It never says the land of Eden anywhere. Adam is said to have dwelt only in the garden, the Gan, whereas Eden is said to never been witnessed by any mortal eye. Eden, therefore, is a totally spiritual concept that God's physical creation cannot interact with. People are looking for Eden. All these people today, archaeologists, they're looking. There's like 4 or 5 credible archaeologists today that have 4 different spots all over the Middle East that they say they found the Garden of Eden. Okay? They found the land of Eden, they say. But they're missing the spiritual concept of what was taught and understood, that what was being said here. Eden is a spiritual concept that God's physical creation cannot interact with. The heavenly Garden of Eden that God put in the Garden of Eden was so that man could interact with what he couldn't interact with, because man's physical. Okay? And in that heavenly garden, the dualistic the earthly came and existed. They hovered together. They were in unity, one another. Okay? So the heavenly Garden of Eden was united with the earthly Garden of Eden, thereby causing an interaction of the physical creation with the Creator. Because it's in the garden, the Scripture says that the voice of Adam heard the voice of God. It was like he was walking in the cool of the day. There was this interaction in that garden. Anybody here heard God speaking today? We hear God speak in different ways, but we didn't hear that clarity like Adam did. Adam, where are you? After he sinned. Anybody ever hear that today? It was a different environment. It was on the earth, but there's this little connection to the spiritual that we can't see, that God did this through the garden to tie it into the physical realm and how he had interaction with God. Okay? And you see now that when they were kicked out of the garden, it's because of the sin-fallen nature, that now that can't have interaction, because unrighteousness cannot have interaction with a righteous God. We'll play this out. The river that flowed out of Eden was a spiritual concept. This river flowed into the heavenly garden, as we saw in that verse. A river flowed out of Eden in to water the garden, which is a spiritual counterpart. The river that flowed into the heavenly garden of Eden, which is the spiritual counterpart of the manifested physical river that flowed into the earthly garden of Eden, where Adam dwelt. If you can understand it, it's deep. But what we can't see, this river that exists, that's spiritual, it comes into the heavenly garden that God created prior to creation, and that was the contact point with the physical earth that he would now create. When Adam's in that environment, the New Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem, they're united together, that when that water, that river, hit and made contact with the physical, and I know this is, it's really hard to be saying this because I can't relate these spiritual things, but I'm doing the best I can. It became a physical reality that there was a river flowing through the physical earthly Garden of Eden. It actually was flowing there. Okay? Then we go back to Revelation 22. Remember, there was a pure river of water of life flowing through that heavenly Jerusalem. So we know there's one river that flows through there, not 4. Okay? So it flows from Eden into the heavenly Garden of Eden, and it manifests physically in the earthly Garden of Eden. Then it says, and from thence it was parted. Okay? From the garden, the earthly garden, where it physically flowed, where Adam could actually touch, feel it, and all that, we conclude that it parted within into these 4 fountainheads just coming out of the earthly garden, because there's only one river in the New Jerusalem, the new garden, heavenly garden. Okay? Now, according to rabbinic sources, Rabbi Hirsch talks about this Ra'ashim here does not mean branches of rivers, but 4 separate heads. He understands, and much of Rabbinic Judaism understands, that this river starts as a single stream. It evidently disappears into the ground, something we can't understand, and springs up again in 4 different locations as 4 separate rivers, but that's in the physical world. Because there were no rivers. All the water was in one spot. This is where rivers came from, to begin with. Okay, here's something I drew. Not entirely accurate drawing, but a river flowed from Eden to water the Garden of Eden. This is the contact point with the physical world, with the earthly garden below it. Physical reality, somehow it goes underground. That's probably symbolism that it's in the earth, the physical earth. It will part, and I know they don't all come up together. They come up in different places, but they come up as the Pishon, the Euphrates, the Hiddekel, and the Gihon. It tells us that the Pishon went to the land of Havilah. We'll talk about that in a moment. The Euphrates was called Parat. It doesn't say anything about where it was, but the assumption is it's in Iraq. The Hiddekel, most scholars say it's the Tigris River because they want to make the Euphrates and the Tigris, those two rivers, to put the Garden of Eden there. But you don't know that. The Gihon, that's going to be the one we really talk about because we have a pretty good idea where the Gihon was. Okay? You know what I'm talking about, Robert? All right. So it went underground and it came out 4 heads. That's not accurate right there. It was 4 different places. It wouldn't be all together. So that kind of helped summarize it a little bit. All right. It does say that Hiddekel did go to Assyria. So it's probably in that vicinity. It does say that the Gihon went to Cush, which is mostly translated as Ethiopia of today. And the Pishon, Havilah, which is usually like Saudi Arabia or even down to Yemen in that area. But it doesn't say nothing about Euphrates. It just calls it the Parat. The 4th one was the Parat. Now Moses is credited with writing Genesis, right? But he wrote it after the fact, right? He had knowledge that was given to him by God and scrolls or whatever, and he was inspired by God and he wrote it down for us, but he wasn't there. Okay? The place names associated with these 4 rivers that are listed in Genesis 2 came later, like Assyria. Nobody lived in it. Where's Assyria? The Syrians didn't live there yet. Man was just created. These all came later based on directional places where these rivers were. Research on the location of the Garden of Eden rarely takes into account the geographical changes to the earth after the landmass was divided into continents. What caused it to divide into continents? Would that change maybe where the rivers might be? What we see today, would they be in the exact locations of where they were? Did the same rivers reappear in the same locations after the flood? I don't know. But these are things that you don't talk. The researchers that find all the Garden of Eden spots, they don't talk about these things. They ignore them. What about the great upheaval that caused the formation of the Great Rift from the Dead Sea to Turkey? From today's landscape, it would be virtually impossible to find the exact location of these 4 rivers' original locations. This is Israel up here, and this is the Dead Sea. This is this great rift. And Robert, if you go a half-hour drive from Jerusalem to the east to the Dead Sea area, it's a drop. I see Jerusalem is how high? 3,000 feet above sea level, and the Dead Sea, I think, what is 1,200 feet below?
Right.
So you drop over 4,000 feet in a half hour. Something catastrophic happened that goes all the way up to Turkey that shifted this whole landmass. Now, you have to understand that when you have rivers are based on when the waters that begin the foundations of the rivers flowing, they come up based on heights, and they flow down. So like a lot of mountains supply the source of where rivers start. This would change all the aspects of where rivers were and where they flowed when this great event happened, whenever it happened in the history of man. The Dead Sea, this whole rift, is the lowest place on the planet Earth. Okay? And it's interesting because the Dead Sea, for many millennia, was called the Lake of Fire. You see it in ancient books going way back by explorers. It was always burning. Even up to the 1800s, it would start on fire because of the asphalt and the bitumen that would be on the surface of the sea. And it's just interesting. It's the lowest place on Earth, and the nickname was the Lake of Fire. And there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's another subject.